pretty well, but today we had some sort of wee problem syncing the audio and the video and everything. So my colleague Jared is going to sort of move the screen here for you. Tony Byrne with Real Story Group. We used to be known as CMS Swatch. Changed our name to the Real Story Group really to better reflect what we're doing, and I'll explain that a little bit better. But once again, thanks for your patience, for hanging on. Apologize about the hassle. We're supposed to know software, but sometimes it gets the better of us, as I imagine it gets the better of you. So Jared, can we just go to the next slide, please? So if you don't know us as CMS Swatch, we analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the different tools, and we publish research that evaluates them head-to-head, including not just the strengths of the vendors, but also the weaknesses of the system. And then the other thing that we do with our research customers is we advise them on successful technology selection. And of course, one of the big questions that comes up is, I have this incumbent vendor, should I actually be switching here? So before we go on, also just a little bit of housekeeping. You can ping us a message through the system. Just send a question through the actual system itself, and then we'll have lots of time at the end to get to as many as we can. And the ones that I don't get to, or that Jared isn't able to respond to himself, then we'll just take offline and we'll email you. So next, please, Jared. This session today is brought to you in cooperation with CM Pros, Content Management Professionals, a nonprofit professional association for content management professionals, not just web content management, but all kinds of different CMs here. It's a community of practice, and they are organizing a very interesting annual survey, and really what could probably be the largest survey to date of content management professionals. And they're going to sort of tell us who we are and what we are interested in. So I really encourage you to complete that survey. And if you find yourself at San Francisco next week, they're holding their spring summit, typically the day before the Gilbane conference, where they're going to have some interesting sessions with the results of the survey, and also some discussions about the ROI of a CMS with some people from Welchman Purepoint, Rob Rose, formerly of Crown Peak Technologies, and some others. So I encourage you to check into that and see if you can participate. Okay, let's get into it with the next one, please, Jared. So the agenda today is we're going to start out with, when is it not a good idea to switch? In other words, I'm sure many of you came to this session wondering whether you should, and it's not always the case that you should be switching tools, so we'll talk about that. But then also, when is it a good idea? When should you really be thinking about switching vendors or switching technologies? And one of the themes here is going to be business problems that masquerade as technology shortcomings, of which there are certainly many. And we'll talk about what is state-of-the-art in web content management, what should you expect out of a new system, and then what should you do as a next step. Now, I'm going to assume that you already have a content management system now. It may be homegrown, it may be packaged, and there's no doubt there's several of you who don't have a CMS yet. And I think that many of the concepts and things that we delve into today are still going to be relevant. So, Jared, if you can advance the slide here. So, some almost never good reasons to switch. So the key word there is almost, but these are some of the things that people come up with that we sometimes find are not particularly good rationales. First one is, well, we philosophically feel like we should be working with a different type of software, maybe open source, or we should be working with a local supplier, not because we get better support, but because we want to keep the money locally. We often see this among, say, local government, regional governments, who want to work with a local or regional vendor simply to keep the money that they're spending locally. And this typically is not a business approach and doesn't always lead to happy outcomes. The other thing that we often see, and it's more common than you might think, is sort of interpersonal conflict with your vendor or your integrator. Often, there's some, either the account rep or lead support person or something that you just don't, there's some conflict there. You don't get along, you don't understand each other. And these sometimes seem intractable, but often are actually fixable by just switching people. And sometimes it's important or even necessary to switch people on both sides, and then you can kind of restart the relationship. The other reason, it's typically not a good reason to switch, but we often see is when a big vendor will offer you free or low-cost web content management software as part of a larger deal. And this is very often the case with platform or ECM vendors like Documentum, to some extent Microsoft, IBM, and Oracle, who say, look, we're selling you all these other seats for all of this very expensive and important document and records management, business process management, workflow, portal, search, so on and so forth. So here, it's kind of like the roof rack on the SUV of your car. Here, take this WCM software, and we'll just toss that in for free. Usually because, among other things, it costs less anyway and becomes kind of a giveaway. And so you've got to really be careful about a free lunch here. It's not a good reason to switch, particularly if you have a system that's working pretty well for you already, or it's got some problems, but it's from a vendor who really is focused on web content management. And I would argue, with the possible exception of Microsoft, that the four vendors there really are not particularly focused on web content management, and it really shows in their approach to their web content suite. So next, please, Jarrett. So here's some debatable reasons to switch. So that means, you know, these are reasons that come up that are sometimes plausible, but we tend to suggest that people maybe pause and not jump here just because of this. So the first one is you need some sort of nice-to-have functionality that you don't have in your system right now. And you know, these could be user-generated content, mobile delivery, community services. These aren't going to stop you from publishing your website, but they would add more value. And in our experience, these can often be applied separately through third-party tools that might work on top of your content management system or besides your content management system. Moreover, it's possible that someone in your vendor community, you know, someone in your customer community who used the same vendors has already solved this problem, has come up with some modules or a certain approach to retrofit this functionality. And of course, that presupposes that there is a decent community around your product, and that's something that we'll get to later. The other, of course, chronic problem is contributor dissatisfaction or low adoption. And this is a serious issue, and I don't want to make too much light of it, but you always have to ask yourself here, you know, is it the implementation or the tool? So if we look at this picture of the men's room on the right, it's certainly feature complete, but clearly there's an implementation problem here. So, you know, how do you know whether it's an implementation problem or not? And that's a tough one. I'd say that's, you know, a significant number of the times when our subscribers call us in, that's one of the things that they're asking us, you know, did we screw up the implementation, or did our advisor screw up the implementation, or is there something fundamentally missing or wrong with the software? And that's a tough one to answer. One of the things that we'll typically go back to is, you know, trying to align the implementation against the business case and the business objectives, and how much, to what extent did you actually apply what you were trying to achieve from a business objective? What was the skill in the background, and particularly experience of that tool of the implementation team, because that's a huge variable in success. And then the other issue is, in talking to other customers of the same vendor, are they experiencing the same problems or not? And that's really a big one. If they're all experiencing fairly similar problems, or many of them are, then that's an indicator that you're trying to do something with the system that it doesn't really natively want to do. Now, at the end of the day, this may not matter, that the tool or the system as you've implemented it has such a bad reputation internally that that it's a foregone conclusion. Look, you know, it's too late. It may have been the implementation, not the vendor, but that implementation and that vendor has such a bad reputation internally that it's not recoverable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too, because I think there's ways you can avoid that. So the other reason why you might want to switch, but you actually want to sort of give it pause, is you're getting really poor tech support. Now, the question to ask yourself here is this chronic or is it temporary? If it's temporary, this can often be adjusted by finding different channels within the vendor, by making your unhappiness known, by threatening to cut off your maintenance. There's any number of things you can do there. You also have to ask yourself, are you working with them in a positive way? Are you working with them to try to adjust it, or are you just sort of throwing things over the wall? The other question is, do you have alternatives? Because there's many other ways to get support from independent consultants, integrators, the community that may or may not suffice for you. Then the other reason that we hear very often is internal vendor consolidation. So the idea is, look, we have too many different content management systems here, and we need to just consolidate them just simply to have fewer. So I understand that rationale. It clearly makes life easier for IT, but you have to ask yourself, does this actually bring business value? In other words, by just shoehorning different scenarios into the same content management system, are we actually improving the value of what we're publishing and the value of our interaction on the intranet or the public website? And if the answer isn't yes, then you shouldn't just do consolidation for its own sake. And that's going to be another issue that I'm going to come back to in a couple slides. So, Jared, can you move us along here? The next slide, please. I think we might have experienced, unfortunately, some other problems here. So what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, I'm going to kind of jump ahead, even though it may not be in front of you right now, and that is. What are some plausible reasons to split? And what I'm going to talk about here are basically kind of dividing technical from business issues. So the first one would be, what are some set of technical issues? And I understand that many, if not most of you, are not seeing this particular slide, but I'm going to just talk to it and then we'll come back. And again, I apologize for the technical snafus that we're experiencing here. But the first issue is, is this an unmitigated failure? In other words, you tried hard to make the system work, you've brought in experts, but you still can't, publish your software. So, maybe there's some basic content types that you need to publish that just aren't publishing, and there's any number of different things that can, go wrong there. Or maybe and by the way, this seems like maybe this seems like it shouldn't happen. How could something just fail outright? And if that's happened to you, don't feel bad, because we actually run into this, with surprising regularity, that someone implemented a CMS and there's just some basic thing that they can't get to work in their environment. Often this revolves around like scalability or publishing and the whole publishing process and the speed of the publishing process. So anyway, you shouldn't necessarily feel bad if that happens to you, because this happens, right? The other issue, which is maybe more frequent, which is that for you, upgrading constitutes substantial redevelopment. That means that you've customized the solution so much that you've diverged, or as the cartoon points out, you've forked off the main path. And so what happens is that instead of an upgrade, fundamentally it's a replacement, and that you have to start from scratch. Yes, with the same vendor, but still what happens is that the level of effort required, and potentially even some licensing implications, really make it that from a cost perspective, and maybe even from an experiential perspective, it's not going to be all that much different from going and finding an alternative. So at that point, you're kind of starting over, and that is a good time to consider the broader WCM marketplace. Should you actually be working, now that you're starting more or less from fresh, should you be considering a new vendor? So Jared, you can move us along here. Some other plausible reasons to switch, again on the technology side, are that you simply need a change in platform. And so it could be that you're running on-premise software and you want to switch over to a SaaS platform. And that could be because you simply no longer have the IT resources that you thought you were going to have to just run this thing internally. Or sometimes we'll see it vice versa, actually. In SaaS or software as a service or hosted suppliers, they don't always talk about this, but we do sometimes see companies moving from a SaaS environment back to on-premise, which almost always means procuring different software. And this can be for a variety of reasons. It can be a change in approach internally. It could be problems over performance or other issues. It could be because suddenly you have new integration requirements that require you to keep the solution in-house, right? The other thing that we see, not commonly, but we do see it, is a kind of a change in technology regime where your company is, in terms of its internal expertise, it might have switched from Java to .NET or vice versa, or going from Java and .NET to more lighter weight language such as PHP, and that the skills that you have to manage your platform are perishable, so you really need to think about maybe getting to a new system. And then finally, you need some really critical functionality that's unavailable in your incumbent system. So here I'm kind of distinguishing critical as opposed to before. Earlier I was talking about sort of nice to have. And so the idea here is, there's just some certain things that you may not, that suddenly you find you need that simply don't exist as a native service. So it may be around records management, auditing, and compliance. Not necessarily that you'd see a lot of those services within a web content management system, but you need to integrate with some sort of service, and or you need particular types of auditing. Maybe you've been sued and realized that the way that you were organizing and archiving and retaining your content in your web content management system doesn't suffice, or there's some regulatory regime that you have to adhere to, and your current system won't cut it. The other thing is that if you're managing a more static environment and you suddenly need more dynamic interaction, being able to move to more dynamic delivery can be a critical factor. You may need to support multiple sites, particularly multilingual sites, and multilingual contributor interfaces. You can kind of see the interface below where they're using non-Latin right-to-left characters in the actual, as the actual content. That's one thing, but then the other issue is your software actually internationalized so that the user interface, the contributor interface itself, can support multiple languages, and has it been localized effectively in those languages? And so when you go from kind of a unitary language to multiple language, this becomes a big deal and is a pretty significant differentiator. Then the other thing that can often happen is growing or shrinking since your initial implementation. In other words, you implemented against a particular scope, functionally, but also the number of contributors, the amount of content, and suddenly you're realizing that this is blown out and the system that you have just doesn't really scale all that well from the interfaces, the repository, or sometimes we'll see it the other way, and it's not surprising that we'll see enterprises overinvest in a particular solution that may have a very scalable repository, but now they've shrunk and this system is really too big to maintain. They need something smaller and simpler. And then the next one is a big one, and that's the transition from page to component-oriented. So Jared, if you can move us along here. And so the idea is that you may be managing content as pages, and for many editors, that's a very simple way of doing it. So here's an example of a content management interface at a university that basically organizes content as a set of pages. And this is really easy for editors to understand. So I don't want to be too critical of this approach. And for many websites, it works very, very well. For this, I just navigate to the page. I can determine the file name, the page title, which template is applied, some basic configurations here. And then I just edit this page, right? And so this works for a lot of organizations. There does come a time, not in every organization, not in every use case, but in many use cases, where this just doesn't suffice, where you need a more component-oriented approach, where you have more disconnected sets of content elements that you may mix and match on a page, that you may mix and match across multiple websites, that are going to be repurposed in different places and potentially under different devices, different languages, so forth, and you need a more component-oriented approach. So Jared, if you'll advance us here. The idea here is you're sort of managing content more like data. And for authors and organizations, not to mention the technology, this is a really huge switch. So, there's a whole set of organizational and cultural and operational changes that have to be made here for you to be successful, and certainly a lot of retraining and re-expectation setting. But then, yes, at the end of the day, there's issues around technology, right, that certain web content management systems are going to support a more component-oriented world better than others. The key issue is not even just physically whether they can do it from a data model standpoint, but what are the kind of interfaces that it exposes that allows you to really successfully manage components, which is hard. This, for example, has traditionally been one of the knocks against SharePoint as a web content management system that is very page-oriented. in 2007, remains somewhat page-oriented in SharePoint 2010, and that is something that limits it in certain environments. So we can move along here then, Jared. So what are some other reasons to switch that aren't necessarily technical in nature, but are more sort of business-oriented? And so these are things that are reasonable reasons, are reasonable justifications for wanting to switch. So the first one is the product or the vendor is going away. So the vendor, of course, being more serious than the product, we find that vendors themselves don't go away too much. They do get acquired. Sometimes they get sold. They may open source the code base. Sometimes products do go away, though, when one vendor is acquired. One of the more obvious ones recently has been Serena Collage, which had a big footprint, at least in North America, in the higher education space. Serena, as a company, is still thriving. They just decided to go in a different direction and sunset the product without selling it, actually. So it's kind of still lingering there, kind of alive but undead. I think there's similar issues that may emerge as far as Red Dot within the OpenText landscape, where OpenText is focusing more on its Vignette WCM suite. OpenText is still supporting Red Dot. It's still making some minor enhancements to it, but its long-term future seems really quite suspect right now. So so maybe there's no urgency to switch, but certainly I think we're advising people that they ought to have some kind of a long-term plan to seriously consider a switch in that case. And so what do you look at here? Well, one is that the product and the community is really more important than the vendor. Is that if there's a substantial community around a product, the longevity of that technology is going to be much more durable than if there's a relatively small or immature community around the product. And then, of course, the availability of independent developers. That's an important indicator of the success of a particular tool as well. So if there's a number of independent developers who can help you patch and improve and support and even extend the product, then that's going to also extend its lifespan as well. The other business reason is that you've merged with another company, or there's some business consolidation, and instead of two websites, you want one, and a more single source of the truth. So this is a situation, obviously, where you just have to decide, kind of one or the other, or maybe a new one is going to do better for your sort of combined environment. The other one is a little trickier, and it kind of relates to this consolidation thing that I was talking about and even disparaging a little bit earlier, which is you may have too many CMS tools doing the same thing. So the key thing there is doing the same thing. So if we tend to look at this when we do our evaluations in terms of sort of a scenario approach. So if you look at the chart on the right, it's a set of 12 fairly universal scenarios which revolve around what type of web publishing operation, or fundamentally what type of site are you running, or sites. And so what we're doing here is looking at autonomy, interwoven team site, and we're looking at its fitness against various potential services. So it tends to work well in environments, or wants to fit an environment. We have an ultra-large single site. Doesn't always work all that well if you want multi-channel publishing or global intranet. Of course, the vendor, in this case Autonomy, can point to examples of customers who do those sorts of things, but it's a question of what does the system actually want to do. So, if you have two tools that both do really well for your global intranet, then yeah, maybe it makes sense to consolidate around one of them. But if you have one that's really good for, say, microsites, but it's not particularly good for your global intranet, then to make that single tool work really well for both of those scenarios, it's going to take a lot of time, money, and painkillers. And so you have to ask yourself, is a world of one CMS tool really better than a world of two? But on the other hand, if you're trying to generate microsites from two different content management systems, then probably it makes sense to consolidate and just do one scenario, one platform for one scenario. Then the other thing that we see fairly frequently, especially around sort of younger companies, is there's a change in the business model that simply requires different functionality. You're either shifting from products to services, or from services to products, or a different kind of mix that requires you to interact with your customers and your suppliers in fundamentally a different way, and now the tool that you have isn't a good fit. And there's similar things around there with respect to your distribution models and target audience. So as those things shift, then that's a good time to sort of reconsider, do you have the right technology? And this relates again to fit, right? That fundamentally what's happened is your scenario has changed. And to the extent that your scenarios and use cases have changed, is the tool that you're working with, is it still a good fit? And that's, of course, always a good thing to reconsider. So Jared, next, please. So then the flip side to this is we'll sometimes hear reasons from internal organizations that talk about why they should stay even when they're having serious problems. So, these are some, I guess, I won't necessarily call them excuses, but these are some rationales that you probably want to really think twice about because they're not necessarily good rationales. So one is our developers know the tool really well. So obviously that's important. You do want your developers and your system administrators, and for that matter your authors and others, to know the tool really well. But the question you have to ask is it getting us the business value, or is it fulfilling the purposes we want? And hopefully with training and outside resources, you can get to know the new tool really well as well, but it can deliver more value. Then the other rationale we hear is, well, it's cheap. Our system, we may not be paying even maintenance on it. We're certainly not paying any licensing anymore. It's not costing us a lot of money, so let's stick with it. And I understand that rationale, but you really have to measure that against the opportunity cost, that if you're not accomplishing what you need to and your content management system's holding you back, then, what's the price of that as well? Then the other thing that we hear very often is our requirements are too specialized. We're unique. We're not like anybody else. We'll never find the right alternative. What we've done is so customized to just what we need that we shouldn't move. And the reality is that in some cases that's true. Particularly we see that, for example, in large media organizations who often do have very specialized requirements. But on the other hand, particularly with the number of platforms that have emerged that you can do custom development with, we find that there's very often a very nice 80-20 spot where you can get the majority of what you need out there from a commercial, or some platform, whether it's commercial or open source. Then the other thing that we very often hear is the last two are really related, that we've invested so much in this platform that, it would be a shame to get rid of it. So this is really looking backwards rather than looking forwards. I understand the institutional dynamics here, that people don't want to necessarily admit that they've made a mistake. What sometimes happens is you get these sort of crazy user interfaces like the one you see there that's become so Frankenstein from all the different changes and customizations that really it's worth starting from scratch. And the point is how much that you spent before, but really how much are you going to spend going forward to get what you need. Then the last one, which we hear very frequently, is, but wait, the next release, the next patch, our next customizations, it's going to solve all of our problems. And then, lo and behold, that comes up again. Oh, the next release, the next patch. And sometimes vendors are guilty of claiming this as well. And the reality is that when this starts happening multiple times, then you realize that there's some sort of problem here. There's a mismatch between what the system or the technology is doing and where you're wanting to go. And that's a good time to really reconsider. Okay, next please, Jared. So that was all the reasons why you might want to switch, but the reality is that sometimes people switch tools and encounter some of the same problems. And that what this suggests is maybe the tool wasn't the problem, but also there are just some difficult things that our industry is still dealing with that are really only partially technical in nature. So there's some hard problems here that if you wave a magic wand, it's not necessarily, you can improve them, but not necessarily completely solve them. So one is, dealing with cranky rich text editors and doing word conversion. This is a hard problem. It relates more to the difficulties in getting clean HTML out of Word and keeping your editors happy at the same time. This is a chronic issue, is always going to be a chronic issue. We're getting better experience with these editors. I think vendors are beginning to make better choices here, but this is never going to go away. It's the same thing around true multi-site management, which is a hard problem. It's easy to clone sites. It's very difficult to deal with all of these children that you create once they start growing up and having to address them all as a collective. There's a number of operational challenges that we can get into in the Q&A if you're interested in. Multi-site management is a feature of the software, but of some software, but just because it's a feature doesn't mean you're going to be successful at it. The other issue is better usability for non-technical authors. We're finding the systems getting more and more complicated with every day and appealing more to the power user and less to the non-technical user. It's a chronic problem in our industry. It's not getting necessarily better. So if you're one of those who still has a highly distributed editorial model, I think this is going to continue to be a problem. Rich integrated traffic analytics, also a problem and a concern, and there's various ways of addressing that as an industry. We're still kind of figuring that out. If you make very frequent template modifications, that can be an issue as well. So that's clearly a potential challenge there, particularly for non-technical people to make template modifications. And then finally, configuration management for business people. So this is, many systems now give you the capability for business people to make adjustments in the system, but how do you track those? How do you roll them back? How do you make sure there's no collisions or problems in testing? Also an issue and a problem with many contemporary tools. So Jared, if we look at the next slide, what it is kind of an example of a power user interface. So this is managing access control. It happens to be Sitecore. It could be any number of different vendors. And so you have to ask yourself, you know, this is extremely powerful. So that's the good thing. You can get incredibly granular control. But is this actually easy? And Sitecore has since made some modifications to this. And to be fair, I'm not trying to pick on them because Sitecore has many good things that we would say about it as well. But this is where a lot of the industry is going, is giving you a lot of granular power. But with that power comes complexity and something where you really kind of have to be more of a specialist in the tool to be able to manage the system. So next, please, Jared. Now, there are some things that are definitely state-of-the-art. And so if your system doesn't do these, you ought to think about, you know, these are sorts of services that you ought to expect. And particularly if you're looking in the marketplace, these are things you ought to look for very carefully because they should really be the norm. And the first one is in-context editing, which is being able to browse to a page within the CMS and edit right there on the page or have it pop a form. Being able to visually identify the differences between two versions of a page, hopefully even right within a workflow. So that's the screen you see below where it's showing you some changes side by side. This is really important, by the way, in localization scenarios. So if you're, for example, a national government agency in Canada and you have to publish simultaneously English and French, and then you make a change to the page that maybe the original language is French, then you need to show the English translator what was the actual change that was made. And so this kind of visual difference makes that a lot easier. Being able to configure the contributor user interfaces to make it easier and often simpler. To be able to support different types of workflow, both task-oriented as well as more collaborative. To be able to organize content as collections so that you can archive, workflow, and process whole groups of content or groups of pages rather than individually. To get some system reports out of the system, because if you can't measure, you can't manage, right? And this is about content management. And this is an area where vendors particularly differ, where many vendors just sort of ignore it, and others give you really rich system reports about what's going on in the system. And then finally, separation of concerns, which is that to be able to have some contributor-facing services that work just within the firewall and are turned off on the delivery side for security reasons. And then on the delivery side, maybe or maybe not having contributor services, which can make you more performant and again make it more secure. So having kind of more architectural flexibility here is increasingly important, particularly as you scale. So next, Jared. So the most important thing to do, really, if you're using a system right now, is to go through more of a continuous review cycle. So you're not waking up one morning and you're finding, hey, we're 3 years behind where we need to be. And make this part of your governance cycle. So hopefully you're implementing some governance around the content and the look and feel itself and reviewing that regularly. Do we have the right content? Do we have the right look and feel? Do we have the right templates? And the other thing to ask is, every 6 months, do we have the right system? Not that you should be switching every 6 months, but that you ought to be thinking about making improvements and having actual development cycles that sort of get you where you need to be or call that question before it's too late. So the case there is really conducting regular evaluations. And so this idea here, which came from my colleague Adrian Bloom, was, continuous evaluation means continuous evolution, to really think about evolving your product rather than having a massive upgrade, every 3 years and overthrowing the existing regime, right? At a certain point, you may come to a place where evolution doesn't work, and you have to have fundamentally some sort of a revolution. But at least you've done what you needed to do to get there and make that decision. Then the other thing is, if you're starting over, is try to disconnect your system name from the vendor brand. And we say this all the time with portals, web content management systems, even search engines, is that this is not the Vignette website or the Vignette CMS or the Ectron website or the Ectron CMS. You want to make it your contributor zone, your contributor space, your website. And the idea there is that it is, first of all, a psychological benefit because it keeps you more accountable. This is your application. You got it from this vendor, but this is yours. But also, it disconnects people from sort of necessarily blaming the vendor for things that aren't necessarily to do with the vendor, and gives you the opportunity to, if necessary, continue working with that vendor if that's really the choice that you need to go. And it may well be. And so what you don't want is necessarily to have the vendor's brand so completely sullied that it's not resurrectable, even though from a business standpoint it makes the most sense to stay with that vendor. So next, please, Jared. Here's an example of a CMS that may have even been homegrown, but what I really like about it is that there's no vendor name here at all, right? They took out all the vendor branding, and it's their CMS, right? So it makes it, first of all, much cleaner from a user interface, but secondly, it means that you're really accountable for your application and not really anyone else. So if we move on then, Jared, what if you do decide to switch? Okay, so hopefully you've thought pretty hard about some of the pros and cons, and you come to the conclusion that you have a fundamental mismatch between you and your existing system. So let's talk a little bit about the marketplace. And if we move on, Jared, I think one of the key dimensions here is the WCM marketplace, like many others right now, one of the key bifurcations is a tool more of a platform or more of an out-of-the-box product? Now, this is a spectrum, to be sure, but certainly many tools are more platform-oriented, where developers can make custom applications, but that's going to take time and money, or more productized, which means they do certain things really well right away. So, like, for example, in the open source world, this is really the difference between, say, Joomla, which can generate a very small, effective club-type site almost right out of the tarball on day one, versus, say, Alfresco, which is really a Java developer's dream of a platform that they can make all kinds of custom development against. So different people internally tend to be platform-oriented versus product-oriented. We often find IT leadership, for many reasons, wanting to meet future demands, whereas business users very often want it today. Senior management may want to be able to cover multiple use cases, but line employees just want to solve my problem. I'm responsible for these small multi-site or microsites, and I want to just be able to manage those, and I don't want to have to turn to a developer every time. Systems integrators tend to like and tend to push platforms, so you need to be careful there when what you're actually looking for is something cheap, easy, and fast, maybe even from like a hosted supplier. Of course, I'm going to ask you all what do vendors say, and you should all be screaming into your headset right now that they say, we do them both, right? Our system is both a platform and a product. And the reality is that that is largely a myth, that it's very difficult to have something that's fundamentally platform-oriented and extensible and yet out of the box for a particular use case sort of right away. There's a real tension there. And I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other, but that you ought to really keep an eye out. So Jared, if we move on to the last slide here, you really want to understand this in the context of the web content management landscape. We divide it. There's many ways to slice and dice it, of course, by license model, open source, costs, regional footprint matters a lot. And so we get into this in our evaluation research to help you build a profile of the vendors. But one of the ways of doing this is really also looking at this platform versus product spectrum. So, you've got big, expensive, often oversold systems from the likes of EMC, IBM, and others. some upper range platforms from the likes of Tridian and Day, big, expensive, but more focused on web content management. Some mid-range platforms, very interesting space in the marketplace right now. Obviously a lot of tension between customers' expectations and the complexity of the tool, but some very interesting tools there. For example, Sitecore, who I mentioned before. Then you get into more mid-range products, which are very easy to deploy, but could be harder to extend. So you can often get to a quick ROI, a lot of quick value, but then you have to decide, is this going to be the right platform? Will this be platform enough for me 3 years down the road? And then finally, simpler products like Joomla, like WordPress, which many people do use as a simple CMS, which are the most out of the box, but really aren't designed to be extremely extensible, or to the extent that they are, you're going to quickly fork yourself off the main path. So again, I'm not making a value judgment, because many enterprises may have multiple tools here, but the idea is that you want to kind of understand where you fit on this spectrum as you're going out looking at potentially new tools. So let's wrap up here with one final, sort of a couple final. First is encourage you to take a look at our technology vendor map, which helps you find your way, not just on the light blue line there, which is the web content management, but also social computing, portals, search. And you can go to our website and download this and check this out. But then finally, the last slide, Jared, you can also contact us for sample evaluations of our web content management. You can find me on Twitter. Hopefully you saw that that's the hashtag for today's event if you want to see some of the commentary. That's my email. You're welcome to email me any kind of follow-up at any time. I'm hoping that we can manage some Q&A here in the 10 minutes that we have left. And once again, I want to apologize. I know your time is valuable. I'm sorry that we kept you holding there for about 10 minutes, and I hope that the rest of the session made up for it and made it worthwhile. So, Jared, do you, I'm afraid I don't have access to the questions, but maybe you can let me know or let us know if there are any here that I can pull up, or you can Skype them to me, or great.
Great. Thanks, Tony. I assume everyone can hear me now.
Yep.
Good. So we do have a couple questions. The first was asked by a bunch of people, and I'll actually take that one. It's actually the easiest question of the bunch by far. That is, will these slides be available after the webinar? And the answer to that is yes. We will send an email to everyone who registered for this webinar and get you a link to the slides. So that's no problem. Another question that many of you asked in various forms is about, you asked a bunch of questions about individual web content management products and vendors. Mm-hmm. We're probably not going to answer those questions on this now, because there's a bunch of different specific questions, but particularly around where different products fit within your spectrum that you talked about, Tony. And what I'll recommend people do there is to go to our website and click on the Web Content Management Research Stream, and there you can see the tiers that we have established and how we kind of fit these different vendors and products along the spectrum. So that information is out there, so I don't think we need to get into each of the individual ones now, nor make any recommendations at this point. So
yeah, so what that list is, you go to the Web Content Management stream on either realstorygroup.com or cmsswatch.com, and then click on the left where it says Vendor List, and you'll see 45 WCM vendors organized into those 5 categories.
Great. So we do have a couple questions, as I mentioned, and we'll start with one clarification question. This one is particularly around the scenarios that you mentioned, Tony, and particularly around the complex scenarios. So one person asked, could you expand a little bit upon what is the multi-channel publishing scenario?
Sure. So multi-channel can mean a lot of different things. It can mean publishing to multiple very heterogeneous websites. It can be publishing to multiple different targets, for example, publishing out to social media, to syndicating your content in different ways, and it can mean pushing content to print and to, of course, the mobile world, which is a whole different landscape as well. And so a number of things. Those are kind of different sub-scenarios that fall within the broader rubric of multi-channel publishing. But if there's something that they all have in common, it is the ability to understand your content as components, to be able to separate content from presentation at much lower levels than you typically would in a page-oriented system. Very often it involves XML either explicitly or behind the scenes, and so there's a whole set of operational and governance and usability issues that fall out of that, but also just certain tools and vendors that are going to be more successful in supporting you in that environment.
Okay. Next question, Tony, is you mentioned a vendor's development path, and the question is, how important is it to stay on that path?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're looking for a long-term investment and relationship, and if you think it's a good fit with the vendor itself, leaving aside the technology for a second, then you've worked with that vendor successfully. You like the way that they've built a customer community. You like the way that you're able to find independent developers. You think the maintenance price is right. So I'm not talking about the technology here. I'm talking about the vendor. If you think the vendor is a good fit, and we get into a lot of this in our research about how to go through those sort of steps and evaluate that, then it really, I do encourage you to think about the customizations that you make in what the vendors will call a release-safe way, which is getting guidance from them all the way along about the changes that you're making. Are those going to survive a particular upgrade? Now, that doesn't mean that you have to follow each upgrade exactly, on its heels. And in fact, very often there's value, if you can, in waiting to, understand the experience of people who had a greater sense of urgency around the new functionality. But if you have a great sense of urgency, then obviously you're one of the earlier people. And again, a close relationship with a vendor helps you make sure that if you're one of the early adopters of a new dot release or a major release, that they're taking special care of you. Because it is incumbent on them to take special care of you if you are an early adopter. Again, this is also part of a vendor personality that some tend to issue updates and patches and releases more frequently than others, and that we have customers who tell us they love that. They've got the capabilities to be able to adjust that. They want those frequent updates. They're particularly concerned about security, and then we find others that find it just too overwhelming. And they want out of the vendors the ability to skip upgrades and still come back and to just not make them work so hard to maintain the tool. So a lot of that depends on how you're internally resourced as well.
Okay. And I think we have time for just one more question, and that is on how you mentioned conducting regular evaluations. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what are some of the best practices that you can recommend for an organization who wants to conduct some regular evaluations but doesn't know where to start?
Yeah. So, I think that, it's almost a little bit like, maybe regular marriage counseling or something that, once every 3 months or 6 months, you have a sit-down of the major stakeholders, and you decide that you're not going to necessarily look at the content or the templates. You can look at the system, what's working and what's not, and make that part of a regular agenda. And there's different ways of doing this. You can do simple, strengths and weaknesses. I like doing SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. What's going on with our system itself, and get various players on the table. You might even dial in a vendor rep at the end of it to get feedback from them. And I recommend doing this every 6 months, so that and what ought to come out of that ought to be a roadmap that kind of mimics a sort of a software development life cycle. It says, okay, we're going to do version 2.1 of our CMS, and it's going to look like this. And then we're going to go, in 12 months, we're going to go to version 3.0, which is upgrading not just necessarily where the vendor is gone, but also where our application is going, and what are we adding, and how are we modifying it, and how are we improving performance, and all of these other things, and really prioritizing the work that you're going to do on the system itself. And then that will tell you over time whether you're drifting away from where you're starting to fork yourself, or you're actually kind of, it's a regular check, am I in line with where this vendor and product are going? So that one, and if you do start diverging, you get some early signals of it rather than, like I say, waking up one morning and realizing that, you're screwed, and that you have to go through this massive, revamp or a product selection. And if you do it right, it's probably going to take you at least 3 months, maybe 6, plus the implementation. And so instead you sort of plan that, okay, from 6 months from now we can see we're going to need to start looking at new tools, and we're going to need to have one picked within the next year, and we're going to need to get it online in the next 18 months, and we can live with what we have until then. So, this kind of 6-month organized check, and there's different ways of doing that. I happen to like SWOT analysis, but the key thing is that you're looking at the system and the health and the fit of the system itself, as opposed to other checks that you're doing from time to time on the design and the content.
Great. Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
All right, I think we're out of time, and thank you all for joining us today. And once again, we will be sending the slides out to you in the next few days. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us.
Okay. So long.